In today's video, we're taking a break from the weekly lore book to instead take a look at the new Iron Banner armor set for this season and the lore it provides. The main focus of the set is to flesh out the backstory of Saladin, with glimpses into his past, but it also gives hints about his interactions and thoughts upon Crow before he was unmasked as the reborn Prince Aldrin. Today's video won't have much commentary. The stories speak for themselves for the most part. If you have any questions, feel free to ask in the comments below, but let's dive right into it. Some know the legend. We threw ourselves on the blade of tyranny so others may live free. Lord Saladin. Saladin remembers what it was like to be young. He remembers the exhilaration of discovering the infinite power he now holds in his hands. He remembers the terror, too. His first death and the agony of a ruptured lung. His mouth had been too full of blood to form words or plead with his ghost, so he tried with his eyes instead. Saladin remembers his second death because it was quicker than his first. A wrong step in a minefield outside of what used to be a city called Nur Sultan. He laughed when his ghost reassembled him. Then, he cried. Saladin remembers death 3 through 65, but does not dwell on them. Instead, he regrets the thousands of hours of sleep lost to nightmares, and how much less vibrant his recollection of that period is in his life compared to his noble centuries spent as an Iron Lord. Saladin remembers the day he stopped counting deaths. "Something about you is different," Jolder had said, and put her hand on his. Saladin remembers all this and more when he looks at the crow. He feels rage form a hot pit in his belly when Osiris tells him about the young Lightbearer's suffering at the hand of his fellow guardians. Osiris asks him if he can keep a secret. "I don't like secrets," Saladin says, and that's the end of it. Some know the legend. We were forged in the fires of a burning world. Lord Saladin. Saladin remembers burying bodies by the dozens. He remembers being thankful that the ground had thawed early this year, so they wouldn't have to burn them. Fires brought light and smoke brought fallen raiders. Fallen raiders brought more bodies. "It's a vicious cycle," Aphrodite had said as she tied off a funeral shroud with great care. Saladin remembers the bundle being very small. "One day, I'm going to break it." Saladin remembers how easily the body fit in his arms, how light it had felt as he laid it in the grave. He remembers with shame, pretending not to hear Aphrodite's words so he wouldn't need to respond to them. He remembers not having anything kind to say. Saladin remembers all this and more whenever the crow talks back to him. Sometimes he bites down on the inside of his cheek. Sometimes he looks up to find his ghost focus on him with a knowing look. He doesn't say anything to his ghost either. Some know the legend. We rose from the ashes of a dying world to save humanity from itself. Saladin remembers losing his connection to the light. He remembers thinking that the traveler must have discovered his most secret doubts, the darkest thoughts he shared with no one, not even his ghost. He remembers the strange sense of relief that washed over him until his radio crackled to life just moments later. He remembers hearing a voice broadcast to the world that the last city had fallen to the Cabal, but he could not tell you whose voice it was, only that it wasn't Zavala's. "Saladin," his ghost said, sounding like it spoke from the end of a very long, wide tunnel. "You have to move," because Saladin stood unmoving. He remembers staring out the window at the flurries of snow for what felt like a very long time, but could have only been a few minutes. He remembers tracing the outlines of neighboring peaks across the glass with the edge of his knuckle. He remembers the act of remembering. Once upon a time, he taught their names to Zavala, as their names had been taught to him. Saladin, his ghost said again, and Saladin remembers moving. He remembers clutching his radio and rallying survivors, those strong enough to make the journey to the Iron Temple. Saladin remembers all of this and more whenever the Crow challenges him on his cowardice during the Red War. He wants to break the young Guardian's back to teach him a lesson about what it's like to feel helpless. But something stops him. He remembers hearing stories about the Crow's life on the shore before he arrived at the tower, and does not raise a hand against him. Some know the legend. We crossed a burning world with sword in hand, bringing justice and blood. Saladin remembers the simple pleasure of sharing a meal with friends. He remembers Radagast hanging the deer upside down by its hind legs, and how swiftly Perun used her knife to skin it. He remembers Jolder tending the fire with wood cut by her favorite axe, a mighty thing fashioned from steel and embellished with engravings of laughing wolves. It had been a gift from a blacksmith, whose son Jolder effortlessly plucked out of the frozen river several winters before. Putting an arrow through its heart is the easiest part, she teased him. Now you get to sit back and watch the rest of us do the real work. Saladin remembers helping anyway, using Jolder's axe to section off a flat piece of juniper to smoke the meat. He remembers the sound and smell of bubbling fat, and how rich the drippings had tasted when he smoked them in bread. He remembers Radagast asking him to sing the song taught to them by the people of the blacksmith's village, but agreeing only when Jolder and Perun promised to join in. Their voices rose like wolves in the night, and were so raw by morning that none of them could speak. Saladin remembers all this and more when Zavala tells him Amanda has taken the Crow out to drink in the city's streets. He wonders what song they'll sing, if it's anything like the one he's heard everyone humming lately, even though he hasn't tried it himself. Before we move on to the last entry, a small interjection. This melody being hummed about the city is likely Savathun's song, and if you know what that is, it's both very worrying so many people are singing it, but also very good that Saladin isn't. If you want more details on this, feel free to comment down below, but let's get back into the lore. Some know the legend. We crush the warlords beneath our heels so they may never rise again. Saladin remembers the first time he met Zavala. He remembers thinking that the Awoken had a regal bearing like the stags he once hunted on the steppes. His shoulders were broad and his chin held high. When he moved, he did so with the strength and purposeful deliberation of someone with the power to determine his own place in the world. You'll never have a son, his ghost had said. But it isn't too late for you to take an apprentice. Saladin remembers their sparring matches. He remembers how Zavala always got back on his feet, no matter how many times Saladin put him down. He remembers refusing to offer the young Lightbearer a hand up, until the day Zavala finally bested him in combat. He remembers lying flat on his back, left shoulder dislocated and ribs shattered, a strange pressure on his chest that made it difficult to breathe. Finish it, Saladin had commanded, because that was the way of things. His ghost would revive him. Saying nothing, Zavala hauled him onto his feet instead. Saladin remembers all this and more when his former apprentice calls him into his office and tells him about the face behind the Crow's mask. Zavala says he knows that Saladin doesn't like secrets, that it's unfair to ask him to keep one of this magnitude, but there will come a time when the Crow needs someone, the way Zavala needed Saladin. You never needed anyone, Saladin insists. Zavala only smiles. Well, that wraps up the lore reading for today. Saladin has a very soft side he doesn't show much, insecurities and doubts, which we get a glimpse into here. But that's all for today's video. If you have any questions you want answered directly, I also stream at Twitch as SkunkyVT, the same as my YouTube username, and feel free to follow here, on Twitch, and maybe even Twitter too. But for now, keep your eyes peeled and your ears keen. Toodaloo!